The Balrog, one of the scariest beings in all of Middle-earth, and ultimately the foe that Gandalf defeats while losing his life in the process. In the same way that Tom Bombadil is a password for Tolkien high society, the Balrog of Moria and the Fellowship's escape from that mountain is one of the most viewed moments in the film trilogy. So naturally, as I was reading the book in preparation for this episode, I was shocked at just how different the company's time in Moria is in Tolkien's writings compared to what we get to see in Peter Jackson's Fellowship of the Ring. Everything from small details like Pippin's Fool of a Took moment not actually happening in this chapter, to larger sequences like Gandalf's true encounter and battle with the Balrog before his fall on the bridge of Khazad-dûm. That's right, in the book, Gandalf actually encounters the Balrog in the Tomb of Balin, and it isn't until an hour later that the events on the bridge happen. And the most surprising part? Gandalf doesn't even know what the creature is at that point, unlike in the movie, where he seems to be mentally preparing for the Balrog even from their very first steps into the mountain. My name is Gibby, and welcome back to episode 13 of Movies vs. Manuscripts Lord of the Rings edition. This is the series where I analyze Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy scene by scene and compare it to Tolkien's original work and lore. Today, we are covering the final chapter of the Fellowship traveling through Moria and discovering the true battle that the company and Gandalf had with the orcs, trolls, and the Balrog of the Deep. In fact, not to get too ahead of myself, but we'll even cover Frodo getting stabbed in the room of Mazarbul, and how in the book he takes on and defeats the troll all by himself. That's right, Frodo is a beast in the books, at least before the ring takes hold of him. If you're a fan of this series, you'll know that I cover 4 different categories of possible deviations from Tolkien's text, which are characters, timeline, location, and plot. But this week is a little different because there are no character, timeline, or location changes. So let's start with a brief refresher of what happens during the scene in the movie, and then we'll dive right into the over a dozen plot changes between the book and the film. So we left off last week with the Fellowship locating the Tomb of Balin, and upon entering, they find a book next to Balin's stone coffin, which contains an account of the dwarves' final moments. Pippin then makes his critical error and knocks an entire skeleton into a well that goes deep into the mountain, causing loud noises that I am sure every orc within a mile could hear. Gandalf calls him a fool of a took, and the company begins to hear orc drums sounding in the deep. They get closer, and Boromir and Aragorn block up the door as they prepare for the attack, but before they officially block things up, Boromir peeks outside and notes that they have a cave troll. The troll eventually slams through the door and the fight begins. There's a long scene of fighting, with orcs getting squashed by their own troll, and the hobbits running around randomly throwing stones or smacking enemies with a frying pan. Eventually, the troll corners Frodo and stabs him, and finally Legolas shoots an arrow through the roof of the troll's mouth, killing it and ending the battle. The company gathers around Frodo as they believe him to be dead, but as Aragorn rolls him over, they realize that he's still breathing. All of them are shocked and delighted to learn that he had been hiding a mithril vest under his clothes, which saved him from the attack. The Fellowship then begins to run through the caverns to exit the mountain, but they are eventually surrounded by thousands of orcs. Before another fight begins, however, a red glow is seen in the distance, and all of the orcs are scared off. As the red glow gets brighter and closer, Gandalf tells them that it is a Balrog, and it is a foe that is beyond any of them. They begin to run, and we see a brief amount of chasing, which includes Frodo and Aragorn nearly falling to their death before they reach the bridge of Khazad-dûm. After the Fellowship crosses, Gandalf stays on the middle of the bridge to face the Balrog. The Balrog swings its sword at Gandalf, and Gandalf deflects it, and then he shouts, "You shall not pass," and slams his staff down on the stone bridge. As the Balrog walks forward, the stone collapses and it falls into darkness. However, before it's completely out of sight, it uses its fiery whip to snag Gandalf by the ankle and bring him to the edge of the bridge, where he tells the rest of the Fellowship to fly and then lets go and drops into shadow. And that is where this scene ends for this week. I'm sure all of you are very familiar with this moment and didn't really need that much of a refresher, but once you hear all of the changes, I think you'll thank me for reminding you what happens in the movie, because this event in the books is almost entirely different. Before we jump into the plot changes, I just want to remind you that you can read along with me each week and experience the Fellowship of the Ring in a whole new way by grabbing your free copy of the audiobook on Audible using my link in the description. It is completely free, no purchase necessary, and it supports the channel at the same time. Plus, Andy Serkis does an amazing job, so I highly recommend choosing his narration of the books. Anyway, back to the changes. So let's try to keep things in chronological order as best as we can, and kick things off with when they first enter the Tomb of Balin, which in the books is known as the Room of Mazarbul. The first change is that there is much more to the book that Gandalf reads than what is shown in the movie. We learn that the book is the Book of Mazarbul, which is the Dwarvish word for records. So the book that Gandalf reads is the Book of Records, and the room in which the dwarves had their last stand is the Room of Records. I have no issue with them condensing this book in the movie, as what Gandalf reads in the film is quite impactful and and summarizes things quite nicely. But what we miss is an account of the dwarves' time in Moria. Everything from when they claimed a portion of the mines, to multiple dwarves losing their lives during fights with the orcs, and finally the account that we hear in the movie about the dwarves' last stand. I guess you could consider some of these as character changes, as multiple dwarves are named in the book. We hear of the deaths of Floy, Frar, Lonnie, and Nali dying to orcs, plus we learn that Oin, whom we know from The Hobbit, died to the Watcher in the Water. Essentially, the company of dwarves were trapped with orcs to the east and the Watcher in the Water to the west. Now for a couple more changes in regards to the Book of Mizarble. First, Gandalf says that they'll take the book with them to inspect it further, as there are many pages Gandalf didn't have time to read. Second, after finding out that they're in the Room of Records, Gandalf tells the Fellowship that he now knows where the room is in relation to the exit of the mines, so he knows which path to take to get out. In the movie, after Frodo gets stabbed, Gandalf simply says, "To the bridge of Khazad-dûm," and I guess we're just meant to trust that he knows the way. But Gandalf is much more on the wavelength of figuring things out as they go, and really doesn't know where they are until this moment of realizing that they're in the Room of Records. So the next change, of course, is about Pippin's nearly fatal mistake. As we discussed in last week's episode, this moment actually happens while we're waiting for Gandalf to figure out which path to take during the fork in the road. They're in a guard room with a well, and Pippin tosses a rock into it out of impulse. Drums faintly begin at that time, and then they die off. The ripple effect of that moment isn't felt until just now, after Gandalf finishes reading the book and tells them which way to go, and then they begin to hear the drums again. Another change occurs when they bar the door in the movie. In the book, we have much more of a sense of direction, as Aragorn says they need to block the doors, but Gandalf instructs him to keep the east door ajar, as that is their only possible escape. In the book, we don't get this level of detail. Plus, after barring the door, they can hear orcs on the other side, and Gandalf goes up to the door and speaks to them. He shouts, "Who comes hither to disturb the rest of Balin, Lord of Moria?" After this, he shines his light outside very briefly to get a report, and comes back to the group and tells them that there are many orcs and a cave troll. Of course, in the movie, this line is given to Boromir. And speaking of Boromir, there is actually a significant change in regard to the cave troll. Upon it entering the room, Boromir rushes it and slashes it with his sword, which bounces off and causes him to drop it. In the book, we are told the cave troll was hairy with scales except on its hands and feet. After this, the unthinkable happens as Frodo feels a swell of courage and shouts, "For the Shire," then rushes at the troll with Sting and stabs its foot. Tolkien writes that Sting was nearly wrenched out of Frodo's hand, and when the cave troll pulled away, it was bleeding profusely. Then the troll retreats and isn't seen again. So as you can tell, this is opposite to the movie. First of all, Frodo actually fights here, whereas in the movie, it's more of a game of protect the president, as he retreats and Merry and Pippin guard him. Second, the cave troll never stabs him, but rather he stabs the cave troll. And speaking of Frodo getting stabbed, that still does happen, but by the hand of someone else. After fighting for a while, the orcs retreat, and then a large orc chieftain comes into the room, and he's the one who stabs Frodo. Aragorn then quickly slices the orc's head in two, but the damage has already been done to Frodo, and the company believes him to be dead as he is slumped over on the floor after being impaled. Unlike in the movie, they don't stop here and gather around Frodo, but rather Aragorn picks up the Hobbit and the whole company begins to run out of their escape door. Shortly after this, Frodo comes to his senses and asks Aragorn to put him down. Aragorn is shocked and amazed and tells Frodo that he thought he was dead, but they continue on as they have no time to discuss this amazing feat. Now, we are finally to our first encounter with the Balrog, which is totally different from the movies. After the Fellowship exits the east door, they head down some stairs as directed by Gandalf, but Gandalf stays behind at the door to the tomb. Aragorn says he won't leave Gandalf, but Gandalf insists that he carry on as swords are no more use here. In the movie, this interaction happens after the Balrog is revealed and is already chasing them, but at this point, Gandalf isn't sure what's behind the door. You see, while the Fellowship waited at the bottom of the stairs, Gandalf was at the door they had just exited and was using a spell to seal it off, but he suddenly felt a presence enter the Room of Records, like he had never felt before. The orcs had gone quiet, and the being had come up to the other side of the door and said a countering spell to undo what Gandalf was doing to seal it off. First off, this is giving us our first hint that this being is beyond any orc, as so far in the series, only those with Rings of Power or the Wizards of Middle-earth have used spells, so this leaves the reader wondering what this creature could be, and so far, Gandalf has no clue. Gandalf, in an effort to seal off the door officially, shouts a word of command which proves too much for the door to handle, and it explodes, knocking Gandalf backwards down the stairs. Before he falls down to where the rest of the Fellowship is, he gets a glimpse of inside the room, and he describes it as completely dark and shadowy. Once Gandalf lands at the bottom of the stairs with the group, he urges them forward as he says that he is very weary, but they must press on. This brings on yet another change, as in the book, Tolkien notes that the company continues down a series of passages for for about an hour before they rest, and they only rest once the drums in the deep cannot be heard anymore. During this rest is when Gandalf recounts his story of the door with them, which I already covered, and he does note to them that he has met his match, and that the counterspell spoken by the being on the other side of the door nearly broke him. But again, it is key to mention that Gandalf still doesn't know what this being is just yet. It is also in this brief moment of rest that Gandalf asks Frodo how he survived, and we get the wild boar line from Aragorn and the more than meets the eye line from Gandalf. One change, however, is that Frodo does not reveal his mithril shirt to them. After resting, Gandalf decides that they must press on, so he goes on a bit further to check what lies ahead. There's a glowing light ahead of them, and Gandalf confirms that the lower levels of the mines are on fire, but he says that they are close to getting out. He also says that there is some new devilry here, which is a line that they give to Boromir in the movie. The rest of the Fellowship then go to see what Gandalf speaks of, and they see a massive cavern with giant stone pillars carved out and holding the room up. This is the room that we see them running through in the movie, but a key difference is that there's no moment of them being surrounded by orcs. Plus, they see a massive fissure in the ground of the room with flames coming out of it. Gandalf tells them that they need to make for the bridge of Khazad-dûm, as that is their best bet of escape, so they sprint through the giant hall and head towards the bridge which lies on the other side. As they approach the bridge, orcs are chasing them and growing in numbers, and eventually the Balrog is revealed. However, as it approaches, the orcs simply get quiet and make a path for it to get through. They don't run from it. This makes way more sense than what we get in the movie, as the orcs and the Balrog are on the same side, so why should they run from it? It is then at this point that we finally identify the being, as Legolas calls it out as being a Balrog. Gandalf then has a "duh, I should have known that" moment, and finally realizes why he struggled so much against it at the door. I think this is another funny Gandalf the Grey moment, as he knows how powerful he is, and I think he was kind of surprised when he struggled at the door to seal it off. So I think after finding out that it was a Balrog that was doing the counterspell, he feels a little bit more relieved and better about himself and his skills. After all, it would be kind of embarrassing if it was just some random orc who muttered the counterspell that beat Gandalf. So shortly after the Balrog approaches, the orcs and the Balrog charge the Fellowship, and Boromir blows his horn, causing them to falter. The Fellowship quickly crosses the bridge, but Gandalf stands in the middle and holds his ground against the Balrog that approaches. A change from the films is that Aragorn and Boromir actually step back onto the bridge to assist Gandalf against this mighty foe, even though he tells them that it is beyond any of them. Gandalf does strike the bridge, and he does have his famous "you shall not pass" line, but a small difference is that his staff actually shatters into a bunch of pieces as he slams it on the stone. And just like in the movie, the Balrog steps forward, falls, and then uses its whip to snare Gandalf. But unlike in the movie, Gandalf doesn't have a moment of hanging onto the ledge of the stone bridge, as in the book he immediately falls into the abyss. It is as he is falling into the darkness that he shouts up at Aragorn and the rest of the group, "Fly, you fools." Lastly, as the Fellowship runs out of the mines, they are chased all the way, and even as they exit, orcs are still shooting arrows at them from the gates of Moria, which causes the Fellowship to continue journeying until they are beyond bowshot from the mountain. The Balrog of Moria and Gandalf's stand against it is one of the most epic parts of the films, and especially once we get the full account of his fight afterwards during the Two Towers. But as you can see, there is a lot changed and left out from what is in the books. Everything from Gandalf not realizing it's a Balrog until the very last moment, to Gandalf nearly dying at the door of the Room of Records when the Balrog uses a counterspell. And that's another thing. Tolkien makes sure to give the Balrog much more of a personality and spirit in his writings. It is a being that can speak and use spells, not just a big buff fire monster with a sword. It is a much more advanced creature than what it gets credit for in the movie. And if any of you know the lore behind a Balrog, you'll know that it is closely related to what Gandalf himself is. If Gandalf is an angel of the Valar, the Balrog is essentially the antithesis of this, a demon of Morgoth. And in a greater sense, it is more powerful than Gandalf, as Gandalf is handicapped in Middle-earth with limited powers, and the evil side doesn't really play by the rules. A big question that people often bring up for the movie is why didn't Gandalf just climb back onto the bridge or wait for help from the Fellowship to pull him up? It's a valid question, but one that has a deeper answer. First, as we just heard in the book, he doesn't actually hang onto the ledge, but he falls immediately. But hypothetically, if he did hang onto the ledge in the book, I believe he would have chosen to drop into the abyss to fulfill his destiny. His staff has been broken, and it has already been foreshadowed by multiple people that his fate lies in Moria. The Balrog is an ancient evil that could wreak havoc if let live. So Gandalf seizes the opportunity to kill it off once and for all, as well as fulfill his destiny and potentially return as something greater. Not that he knows for sure that he would return as Gandalf the White, but I think he knows that if his purpose is to kill the Balrog, then it isn't for nothing. So what are your thoughts on this chapter of the book and the scene of the movie? Do you agree with Peter Jackson's interpretation of the Fellowship's time in Moria, or do you think this scene would have been better spent keeping closer to Tolkien's original text? Comment below and make sure to like and subscribe to stay up to date each week as I release new episodes of this series. And by the way, if you're a fan of Harry Potter, be sure to go check out my Movies vs. Manuscripts series on that franchise, as I recently started that last month. As always, have a great week, and I'll see you in the next episode.